All right, so welcome to part 4. So now we're going to dive into physiological conditioning, which talks about some of the more complicated types of conditioning effects and phenomenon that we can see. So one good example is how you can actually physiologically condition your immune system, which might be of particular interest to you. So this is basically a drug that causes immune suppression. It's immunosuppressant. There's a wide variety of drugs out there like that. But there are some actual examples in which you don't necessarily even need this drug eventually to produce immune suppression. So you take this drug that's an unconditioned stimulus, right? It's a drug you don't have to learn, right? You don't have to sit there and be told about how this drug will reduce your immune system. You can just simply take it and it will reduce your immune system. So this is kind of what we consider like a reflexive response in here. It's unlearned, it occurs biologically. So this is our reflex. Unconditioned response or unconditioned stimulus produces this unconditioned response. However, you can take what would be initially a neutral stimulus, like a sour candy, and right before you take this immunosuppressant drug, say you take one of these sour candies. So you have sour candy, and then you take your immunosuppressant drug. Well, from a biological perspective, you're essentially doing Pavlovian conditioning. You have this stimulus coming into association with your drug that causes a reduced immune system, such that the sour candy in of itself can elicit an immunosuppressive response. So here, essentially what you have is what we call the placebo effect, right? So in a lot of medical and drug trials, we always have to have a placebo group where the placebo group takes essentially a sugar pill that doesn't actually have any of the active ingredients that you're interested in, to see what effect that has in comparison to the population that takes the pill, including the sort of medical ingredient that you're studying that's of interest. So why do we even do this placebo group? Why would a sour candy or why would a sugar pill have any effect on our system at all? Why do we have to compare it to that group versus just a group that doesn't take anything? And the answer is because Pavlovian conditioning. With Pavlovian conditioning, all of us, you can't really raise your hand, but probably nearly everyone has had some experience of taking a pill before, right? You've probably taken a pill at some point in your lifetime. If you haven't, you're probably quite lucky. As you can imagine, probably nearly all of a typical population has taken a pill before, which means that they have previous Pavlovian conditioning between taking a pill and having some biological effect on their body, whether it be an antibiotic effect, whether it be a pain reduction effect, whether it be something. We've probably all taken some pills that have had a biological effect on us. So our bodies have become Pavlovian conditioned essentially such that the stimulus of taking a pill can come to produce a biological effect. And that is what we call the placebo effect. It's not that it's just all in your head and you're making it up that you feel better now because you took a pill, which sometimes very well could be part of it, but it's also partly because pills in and of themselves can produce through Pavlovian conditioning an actual true biological effect on people. So for example, this is just kind of spilling it out more generally. Placebo effects tend to be most high in pain mitigation studies. So say you take an opioid for pain relief, and then essentially that opioid being, say, the actual drug itself, but it always comes in a pill form. So the actual conditioned stimulus of taking a pill is being associated with the actual drug effect of the opioid, which is producing pain relief. And then finally, the pill in of itself, after several trials, will actually produce pain relief, whether that pill contains any opioids or none at all. The pill alone, whether it just be a sugar pill, can actually produce pain relief, thereby being the placebo effect. It's also interesting because sometimes our physiological responses can actually be in the opposite direction rather than the same direction of the response of the underlying drug. So for example, with insulin, insulin is an unconditioned stimulus that will produce an unconditioned response by reducing your blood sugar. However, let's say, for example, every time you take CS, you flash the lights in your house. So you flash the lights around your house flash, which is a sign for you to take insulin. So let's say you have a, or I guess let's say you have a dog, for example. So say you have a dog instead of a light, that a glucose detection dog, and that glucose detection dog puts their paw on your leg. Every time you have a high blood sugar, that tells you that you then need to take insulin, so you take the insulin. So a dog puts a paw on you, tells you to take insulin, you take the insulin. Paw on you, 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 take the insulin. Well, because the insulin causes a reduction in blood sugar, your body's preparatory response to that reduction in blood sugar is actually to prepare an increase in blood sugar. So because your body is now expecting that you're going to take a drug that will reduce your blood sugar, your conditioned response is actually a preparatory response for the reduction in blood sugar, which is basically increase your blood sugar. So to try and maintain homeostasis, your body now knows that your blood sugar is going to be reduced. So in preparation for that, it plans to essentially increase in blood sugar. So then if your dog paws you to indicate to take insulin, that stimulus in of itself could actually serve to increase your blood sugar, because your body is now preparing that you'll be taking insulin soon. And this can actually lead to what we call drug tolerance effects. So essentially, if you go through the this pairing where you associate, say, the light or the dog paw on you to then take insulin, it increases your blood sugar. This is reduced blood sugar. The conditioned stimulus in of itself is coming to produce a increased blood sugar, which means that now if you not only want to decrease your blood sugar because your blood sugar is high naturally, but also when this conditioned stimulus occurs, your body is preparing an increase in your blood sugar. So that means that you need to take more and more insulin to be able to produce the same biological effect as you used to, because now your body is essentially already preparing and fighting against you to be taking insulin. And this is what basically we call drug tolerance. There's some pretty dramatic experiments that actually looked at this under the context of heroin. So say you take heroin, heroin will produce a particularly strong unconditioned response, and that unconditioned response will eventually lead to a kind of counter effect. Your body is preparing to counter effect the direct effect of the heroin. So let's say, for example, that when you take your heroin, it's quite consistent. Say it's a particular location. Let's say whenever you take heroin, you happen to be in your mother's basement. That's the only place you ever take heroin, because that's where you have good access to it, and that's where you feel comfortable. So you take, every time you go down into your mother's basement, that's when you take heroin, and you're only taking heroin when you go down into your mother's basement. So you get a very strong context effect, such that when you go down into your mother's basement, your body is preparing for a conditioned response to counter that heroin. So you go down into that basement, your body's thinking, I got to prepare for heroin, I'm going to counter that effect. So when you're in context A, your conditioned stimulus is producing a conditioned response to counter the effect of that heroin. So in other words, you've built up tolerance to heroin under this context. So interestingly enough, a lot of our drug tolerances that we build when we're taking a variety of kinds of narcotics, they're actually very specific to the context that we take them in. So they can be very specific to the paraphernalia associated with the drugs, and they can be very specific to the locations in which those drugs are typically consumed. So where this becomes particularly important is, say, for example, over time, because you have built up this drug tolerance, you increase your dosage of heroin to produce the same kind of high effect on yourself. So say at first you started taking 10 milligrams. I'm not terribly sure what a good dosage of heroin is, so don't trust me. Let's say when you were first a young child or a kid, hopefully you weren't a young child, but let's just say when you first started off your heroin road, you were taking 10 milligrams and you were always doing it in your mother's basement. And eventually you found out that you just weren't getting the same effect. So you increased to 15 milligrams and to 20 milligrams and to 30 milligrams, then to 40 milligrams and to 50 milligrams. And now it takes you, say, 100 milligrams to get the same effect that 10 milligrams used to give you back when you first started. The reason why you've built this tolerance is because your body has learned that when it sees needles and your mother's basement and all these kinds of paraphernalia, that it needs to prepare for heroin, and it's getting better and better at learning when to prepare itself for heroin, to remove it from its system and to counter those effects. So now, for example, say you essentially remove all of these context effects. You removed this conditioned stimulus effect. So say your mother just realizes that you're taking heroin in her basement every single day and says, no more of that. I'm kicking you out of my basement. I'm shutting the door and you can't go in the basement anymore. You're going to have to find a new location to do that. So you find a new location. You perhaps maybe get a different supplier. You get a different way for it. You've essentially removed all of this conditioned stimuli. You remove this conditioned stimulus that produces a really important counter effect conditioned response. So all of this drug tolerance is gone. So if you are a student of Pavlov and a student of mine, you know that now you are absolutely critically must reduce the amount of heroin that you take. So go back down to your 10 milligram step, because you've built up all of this tolerance, but this tolerance is very specific to the context in which you took it, because it's a Pavlovian conditioning effect. If you don't, you have a really high risk of overdosing. There have actually been experiments that looked at this in rodents, where you take them into a particular room and inject them with heroin. I think it was heroin. Yeah, heroin specifically. Inject them with heroin in that room. And then you slowly build up their tolerance over a period of 6 weeks, so that now all of the animals are at, say, 500 milligrams. Now you take the animal into a separate room and you give, so you take all of your animals, half of them go into the regular room that they always take the drug in, you give them the 500 milligrams, and then you go and take other rodents that have typically are injected in room A and bring them into room B and give them the same 500 milligram dosage. And essentially what happened in that experiment is that the animals that took the higher dosage, but with all of those context effects that they normally have, were fine. Whereas the animals that were brought into the new room and we removed all of those context effects, about half of them overdosed and subsequently died. So this is absolutely critical for a lot of individuals who are drug addicted. If you remove the conditioned stimuli by which you typically take your heroin, you're at substantially higher risk of overdosing, because your body is not going to be producing the same counter effect that it used to do because of the context in Pavlovian conditioning previously. So if you learn nothing more from me, if you build up tolerance to a particular drug and then you change anything about the way that you administer that drug, you need to importantly reduce that dosage of it, because you will not have the conditioned stimuli that your body have been using to prepare yourself for that dosage. So hopefully you learned something important here. So this just recaps in context B. You do not have these counter effects. So say your mom kicks you out of the basement and now you go to your friend's house, which is context B, where you've never taken the heroin. You don't have this counter effect produced, and you are at a substantially higher risk of an overdose. So if you learn nothing, always use the same area, or if you have to use a different area, substantially reduce the dosage, because your tolerance is no longer going to be there. This is also true for things like alcohol or any other kind of drug. If you've ever noticed, you're probably not of drinking age, but say, for example, you are a beer person or a wine person. Beer and wine, wine has slightly higher alcohol values, but not so much. But if you've ever noticed, if you're constantly a wine person, always drink wine, that you've built up a tolerance to that wine so that you can have 2 or 3 glasses and not really feel it per se. because your body has built up some kind of tolerance to it. Still nothing that you want to drive on, right? Because drinking and driving is wrong, but you've built up, say, just if you're at your home, a general tolerance to it so that it doesn't affect you or feel you as much as normal. But then say you drink a beer or take a shot of some other kind of liquor that you're not used to. Well, all of those context effects that come with wine, the taste, the glasses, the aromas, all of those are gone, and you're probably going to feel it substantially more, not because there's any more alcohol in the beer or in one shot compared to a glass of wine, but it's because you haven't built up tolerance to those particular conditioned stimuli, and you've really just built up tolerance to the wine conditioned stimulus. So even though it might be less alcohol, you might be feeling it more because you didn't give your body the same conditioned stimuli that you do with your typical poison or drug of choice. Okay, hopefully that provided you some interesting life lessons, and also highlighted the importance of the placebo effect. Now let's try and bring some of these back into dog training, and in particular, my favorite topic, which is odor detection training. So can Pavlovian conditioning help and support improved performance for our detection dog training? So I conducted a study many moons ago now, where we took 32 dogs and we randomly assigned them into 4 groups. We gave them just simple exposure to an odor. We gave them Pavlovian conditioning to an odor, which would be odor, food in a delay conditioning manner. So if you don't remember what delay conditioning is, go back to lecture 2. We gave a no exposure control, and then we did Pavlovian conditioning to an odor that we weren't going to train them on. So exposure only, gave them 30 minutes of the target odor. This is star anise, which is basically, we used an anise extract odor. Smells like licorice. The Pavlovian conditioning got 10 seconds of odor, followed by food that overlapped in a delay conditioning fashion. The no exposure got no exposure, and then Pavlovian irrelevant was the same as the Pavlovian conditioning, but instead of using an odor we were going to train them on, we used an almond. And this was largely just to control for the fact that perhaps just simply giving the dogs food would improve their overall performance. After we did this for 6 days, we then gave the dogs a series of detection training trials. This is what the Pavlovian conditioning looked like. It was very simple. The dog was in a crate or a baby gate. The odor was presented, and then we had a little food hopper that would drop food down to the dog, something kind of similar to what you saw earlier in lecture 1. Then we had a simple detection training task where we had 2 bins with odor in them, or 2 bins, one had odor in them, one did not. And the dog was required to, oh, I don't know why my video froze. Oh, my video froze, I'm sorry. So the dog was required to dig around in the bucket that contained the target odor. If the video would have continued, you would have seen Bessa digging around in this bucket of pine shavings. What did we find? So this is the Pavlovian relevant group. This is our exposure control, our control, and our Pavlovian irrelevant. So basically giving the dogs just a few days of Pavlovian conditioning beforehand started them off better than all of the other dogs and had them end significantly better than all of the other dogs, such that the dogs were generally pretty well trained, essentially reaching 90% accuracy by the end of 3 days, where none of the other groups were reaching that level. So Pavlovian is important. It can help improve our training performance and transfers over to detection training trials. So it's an important and convenient way to improve and satisfy detection training. So now to hit up a couple of just terminology-based questions or terminology-based things. There are different types of stimuli that we can use for our unconditioned stimulus. We can use, a lot of times colloquially, what we'd say is positive or negative, good or bad. These are not particularly like scientific-y types of terms. The words to try and replace those would be appetitive for things that are positive, rewarding, or pleasing. So things like food would be appetitive conditioning or appetitive stimuli. And then things that an animal would like to avoid, we would call aversive stimuli. So things like shock, bad odors, other types of physical injury, things like that. This is aversive conditioning. So you can have aversive conditioning and appetitive conditioning. Instead of saying good or bad, the technical terminology would be appetitive versus aversive. So we've talked about quite substantially the laws of reflexes. There are 3 laws of reflexes. What are they? Once conditioned, our conditioned stimuli do not necessarily follow the laws of reflexes. They can be slightly different. So remember when we're talking about the laws of reflex, if we increase the intensity of our unconditioned stimulus or of that stimulus, you get a stronger sort of reflexive response. Well, with Pavlovian conditioning, that doesn't happen. So if you have a stimulus that's like a tone, like a beep, if then you do beep really loud, that's actually going to produce less conditioned responding rather than higher conditioned responding. And it's actually going to follow a generalization gradient like we talked before. So the conditioned stimulus needs to be the exact same conditioned stimulus that you train, and any variations of it, whether higher or lower, is going to produce sort of generalization decrement or decreases in responding due to that particular change in that stimulus, following the generalization gradient that we talked about in part, I think 3, but I'm not sure. So a greater CS or a higher magnitude of CS does not necessarily mean to a greater or faster CR. When it comes to unconditioned stimuli, it does. That's what our laws of reflexes are. But our laws of respondence are quite different, and that a greater or lesser CS does not produce greater or faster conditioned responding. Only the CS that is identical to what was conditioned produces the most responding, and anything that's different from that will produce less responding. So think about clicker training. One topic that we haven't really covered so much in Pavlovian conditioning is the concept of clicker training. So if you guys have seen Jurassic Park version something, one of the new ones that came out, at least new to me, not the classic ones when I was a kid. What is that guy's name? Chris Pratt, I think Chris Pratt. Anyway, he's a velociraptor trainer, and they have a particular episode which is frustratingly wrong, where he's doing clicker training with the velociraptors. I'm sure you could have done clicker training with the velociraptor. That's not the most unrealistic portion of this. Velociraptors would probably be very susceptible to clicker training, and I would love to clicker train a velociraptor should the time come. But anyway, he did it completely wrong. So he's got the little clicker, and he's going click, 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 click. Good job. Like that's going to make any difference. So in clicker training, if you do click, treat, click, treat, click, treat, right? So that the conditioned stimulus is click, the unconditioned stimulus is food, conditioned response can be any kind of biological response. If you then go click, 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 that's changing your conditioned stimulus, and that's actually going to produce less responding than would be if you just went click and then gave the unconditioned stimulus. So that was actually really bad velociraptor clicker training. Not that you probably care. And we also talked about extinction. Pavlovian extinction is quite important for a lot of applied reasons, because a lot of sort of conditioning and things that we want to change. Think back to the original video of barking at the washing machine. A lot of behaviors that we want to change can be motivated by fears, that there's been previous Pavlovian conditioning or associations or unconditioned stimuli that associate a fear response. And what we want to do is we want to try and extinguish that particular stimulus from producing a conditioned response or a conditioned fear response. So a lot of times extinction is going to be involved in a lot of our training. However, just simply doing extinction is not going to be considered a very humane kind of treatment. It's sort of like if you were afraid of spiders. So now you need to learn not to be afraid of spiders, that we just kind of have you interact with spiders over and over again to try and extinguish that fear. So this isn't, extinction is an important component of it, but we can introduce extinction as part of our training and our methods in a much more friendly way such that, remember with the dog at the beginning and the barking, she introduced the dog from a very far distance from the washing machine. And this is something that we can use and leverage in our training, such that if you start off in a very far distance, we can make that training much more humane so that that sound is not very scary. It's just a little far away. And so you can build up comfort and reduce extinction of fear at that distance and slowly get closer and closer and closer and closer until you're able to deal with the stimulus right in front of you in a much easier way than simply trying to force extinction. Another kind of important thing to remember is that even though if you do extinction or use something like what we call counter conditioning that we'll talk about in a second, spontaneous recovery is a very real thing. Even if fears may eventually look like they have gone away, it's not unusual for them to then spontaneously recover and come back even after undergoing an extinction period. So I'm going to break here now and return for our last recording in a few minutes.